If you walk through the financial district of Frankfurt today, you will see the gleaming headquarters of Deutsche Bank, its twin towers rising above the skyline like monuments to capitalist triumph. You will see the offices of Commerzbank, Dresdner Bank, and dozens of smaller institutions that survived the Cold War and prospered in its aftermath. You will see the machinery of Western finance humming along as if the ideological struggle of the 20th century had never happened. In 1970, the Soviet Union appeared to be winning that struggle. Its economy was growing faster than the Western average. Its military was expanding relentlessly. Its ideology was spreading across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Western intellectuals openly debated whether capitalism could survive competition with central planning. The question was not whether the Soviet model would endure, but whether the Western model could adapt quickly enough to avoid being overtaken. But the bankers of Frankfurt, London, and New York knew something that the ideologues did not. They knew that the Soviet Union was becoming their customer. They knew that the workers' paradise was borrowing money from the temples of capitalism. They did not realize that this financial relationship would become the thread that, when pulled, would unravel the entire Soviet experiment. This is the story of how Western banks became the quiet executioners of Soviet communism. It is the story of how loans extended in the spirit of détente became the noose that strangled a superpower. It is the story of how the capitalist system that Marx predicted would collapse instead absorbed, exploited, and ultimately outlasted its greatest rival. This is not a story about military confrontation. It is a story about interest rates. It is the story of how the cold logic of compound interest defeated an empire that had survived Hitler's Wehrmacht and claimed to represent the future of humanity. To understand how Western banks came to hold the fate of the Soviet economy in their ledgers, we must examine the peculiar financial architecture of the Cold War. In 1945, the world was divided into two monetary systems that barely communicated. The Western Bloc operated on the Bretton Woods system, with the dollar as the reserve currency and gold as the ultimate backstop. The Soviet bloc operated on the ruble, a currency that was not convertible, not traded on international markets, and whose value was set by bureaucratic decree rather than supply and demand. For 2 decades, this division was nearly absolute. The Soviet Union traded primarily within its own bloc, exchanging goods with Eastern Europe, China, and Cuba through barter arrangements and artificial exchange rates. When the Soviets needed Western goods, they paid in gold, which they mined in Siberia or extracted from their own citizens. The financial systems were parallel universes that rarely intersected. But in the 1960s, a crack appeared in this wall. The Soviet Union discovered that it needed Western technology. Its factories were falling behind. Its agriculture was chronically inefficient. Its consumer goods were embarrassingly primitive compared to what capitalist workers enjoyed. The ideological competition required demonstrating that socialism could deliver prosperity, and prosperity required technology that Soviet engineers could not develop quickly enough. The solution was to buy it. But buying Western technology required Western currency, and the Soviet Union did not have enough gold to finance the imports it needed. In 1964, the Soviet government made a fateful decision. It would borrow from Western banks. The first loans were small, experimental, carefully structured. Soviet trade organizations opened accounts with banks in London and Frankfurt. They borrowed dollars and Deutschmarks to finance specific purchases, machine tools from West Germany, grain from the United States, technology licenses from British firms. The loans were short-term, secured against future exports, and repaid promptly. Western bankers were initially cautious. The Soviet Union was the ideological enemy, the sponsor of communist parties that threatened to overthrow their governments. But money has no ideology. Soviet borrowers paid their debts on time. Soviet trade officials were professional and reliable. The profit margins were attractive because the perceived risk justified higher interest rates. By 1970, the trickle had become a stream. Soviet borrowing from Western banks exceeded $1 billion annually. The Kremlin had discovered that it could fund modernization without reforming its inefficient domestic economy. Western capital would substitute for internal change. The bankers of the West had discovered something equally important. They had found a new market, the communist bloc. Countries that desperately needed hard currency to buy Western goods would pay premium interest rates for access to capital they could not generate internally. The Iron Curtain, it turned out, was not impermeable to money. This was the original sin of Soviet finance. The system that claimed to have transcended capitalism was becoming dependent on capitalist credit. The economy that promised to bury the West was digging itself into debt to Western institutions, and the bankers who extended these loans understood, even if the Politburo did not, that every loan creates leverage, and leverage eventually demands payment. The Soviet Union discovered its financial magic trick in October 1973 when Arab oil producers imposed an embargo on the West. The price of petroleum quadrupled almost overnight. The Soviet Union, sitting on vast reserves of oil and natural gas, suddenly found itself awash in hard currency. Dollars poured into Moscow from customers in Western Europe who needed Soviet energy to heat their homes and power their factories. The debt problem seemed to solve itself. Why borrow when you could simply sell oil? But the oil bonanza created a different kind of trap. Western banks, flush with petrodollars deposited by Arab oil states, needed to lend that money somewhere. They looked at the Soviet Union and saw a creditworthy borrower, a nuclear superpower with vast natural resources, a government that had never defaulted, and an apparently growing economy. The bankers began offering loans on increasingly generous terms. Between 1974 and 1980, Soviet borrowing from Western banks exploded. The gross debt of the Soviet bloc rose from approximately $5 billion to over $80 billion. East Germany, Poland, Hungary, and Romania borrowed even more aggressively than the Soviet Union itself. The entire communist world was being financed by capitalist institutions. Think about the implications of that transformation. The countries that claimed to represent an alternative to capitalism were funding their development with capitalist credit. The governments that denounced Western imperialism were paying interest to Western shareholders. The system that Marx designed to overthrow the bourgeoisie was enriching the bourgeoisie with every loan payment. The terms of these loans contained hidden dangers that Soviet planners either ignored or did not understand. Most of the debt was denominated in dollars or Deutschmarks, not rubles. This meant that the Soviets bore all the currency risk. If the dollar strengthened against the ruble, the debt burden would increase even if no new borrowing occurred. Most of the debt carried variable interest rates tied to the London Interbank Offered Rate, known as LIBOR. This meant that the cost of servicing the debt could increase dramatically if Western central banks raised interest rates. The Soviets were betting that interest rates would remain low. It was a bet they would lose catastrophically. Most of the debt was short-term, requiring constant refinancing. This meant that the Soviet Union was dependent on the continued willingness of Western banks to roll over maturing loans. If the banks ever lost confidence, the entire structure could collapse within months. The Western bankers understood these risks. They priced them into the interest rates they charged. They earned substantial profits on Soviet bloc lending precisely because the loans carried dangers that justified premium returns. But they also assumed that nuclear superpowers do not default. They assumed that the Soviet government would always find a way to pay. In 1979, two events shattered these comfortable assumptions. On Christmas Day, Soviet forces invaded Afghanistan. The Western response was immediate and punishing. President Jimmy Carter imposed a grain embargo, canceling contracts worth billions of dollars. The United States boycotted the Moscow Olympics. Détente, the policy of engagement that had facilitated East-West trade, was dead. Western banks faced a dilemma. Their Soviet loans were suddenly politically toxic. Shareholders and regulators questioned the wisdom of lending to an aggressor state. But the loans already existed. Refusing to refinance would trigger defaults that would devastate bank balance sheets. The bankers chose to continue lending, but they demanded higher interest rates and shorter maturities. The cost of Soviet borrowing increased substantially. At the same moment, a second shock was building in Washington. In October 1979, Paul Volcker became chairman of the Federal Reserve. Volcker was determined to crush the inflation that had plagued the American economy throughout the 1970s. His weapon was interest rates. He raised them relentlessly, pushing the federal funds rate from 11% to over 20% by 1981. The Volcker shock transformed the economics of Soviet debt. Every loan tied to LIBOR became dramatically more expensive. A debt that cost 8% to service in 1978 cost 18% by 1981. The Soviet Union was spending an increasing share of its hard currency earnings simply paying interest on existing obligations. New borrowing became necessary just to service old borrowing. The debt was compounding faster than the economy could grow. By 1982, the Soviet bloc was approaching a crisis. Poland, the most heavily indebted communist country, effectively defaulted, requiring emergency rescheduling of over $25 billion in debt. Romania imposed brutal austerity to avoid a similar fate, slashing imports and reducing its population to near starvation conditions. Hungary teetered on the edge of insolvency. The Soviet Union itself avoided default only by drastically cutting imports and accelerating oil exports. But the price was paid in economic stagnation. The technology purchases that were supposed to modernize Soviet industry were canceled. The consumer goods that were supposed to demonstrate socialist prosperity disappeared from stores. The debt that was supposed to fund development instead funded survival. Western banks had their fingers on the pulse of the Soviet economy. They could see the deterioration in real time through the payment patterns of their borrowers. They knew, even before Western intelligence agencies fully understood, that the communist system was approaching its limits. The tipping point arrived in 1985, from a direction that no banker in Frankfurt had anticipated. In August, Saudi Arabia abandoned its policy of restricting oil production to support prices. The kingdom was tired of losing market share to other producers who cheated on OPEC quotas, while Saudi Arabia absorbed the entire burden of output cuts. King Fahd decided that if prices must fall, Saudi Arabia would at least maintain its volume. The global oil market collapsed. Prices fell from over $30 per barrel in early 1985 to under $10 by the summer of 1986. The commodity that funded the Soviet Empire lost two-thirds of its value in 18 months. For Western banks holding Soviet debt, the oil crash created immediate alarm. The Soviet Union's primary source of hard currency had evaporated. Its ability to service dollar-denominated debt depended on selling oil for dollars, and suddenly oil was worth far less. The mathematics of Soviet debt sustainability became terrifying. Every dollar decline in the oil price cost the Soviet government approximately $1 billion in annual hard currency revenue. A $20 decline meant $20 billion vanished from the treasury. The Soviet Union's debt service obligations, meanwhile, remained fixed in nominal terms. The ratio of debt payments to export earnings exploded. Western banks began restricting new lending to the Soviet bloc. Credit committees that had approved loans routinely now demanded additional collateral, shorter maturities, and higher interest rates. The flow of Western capital into the communist world, which had sustained the system for 2 decades, began to reverse. The new Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, inherited a financial catastrophe. Gorbachev understood that the Soviet economy was failing, but he initially misdiagnosed the problem. He believed that the system needed restructuring, perestroika, not abandonment. He believed that political openness, glasnost, would release creative energies that bureaucratic rigidity had suppressed. He did not fully appreciate that the entire edifice was being sustained by borrowed money that was running out. In 1986 and 1987, Gorbachev attempted to maintain Soviet creditworthiness while implementing reforms. He assured Western bankers that the Soviet Union would honor all its obligations. He pointed to the country's natural resources and industrial capacity as proof that temporary difficulties could be overcome. The banks wanted to believe him. They had too much exposure to Soviet debt to contemplate default, but the numbers would not cooperate. Soviet hard currency earnings continued to decline as oil prices remained depressed. Import cuts reduced the flow of Western technology that was supposed to revitalize Soviet industry. Economic growth, already anemic, turned negative. The gap between debt service obligations and available resources widened with each quarterly report. By 1989, the Soviet financial position had become critical. The country was borrowing simply to pay interest on previous borrowing. The debt was growing faster than any conceivable source of repayment. Western banks, examining their exposure, began preparing for the possibility of losses they had long considered unthinkable. The fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989 transformed the political landscape, but the financial reality was already determined. The communist governments of Eastern Europe collapsed in rapid succession, and with them collapsed the economic arrangements that had sustained the Soviet bloc. The Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, the communist trading organization, disintegrated. The supply chains that connected Soviet factories to Eastern European suppliers were severed. Western banks watched their Eastern European loans deteriorate alongside their Soviet exposure. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany all required debt restructuring as their economies contracted. The banks that had profited from lending to the communist world now faced the consequences of that world's collapse. But there was a crucial difference. The Western banks would survive. The Soviet Union would not. The final act of the Soviet financial tragedy played out in 1991 as the empire disintegrated and its debts remained. By January 1991, the Soviet Union owed Western creditors approximately $70 billion. The debt was owed by various Soviet entities: the central government, state trading organizations, the Vneshekonombank Foreign Trade Bank, and enterprises scattered across 15 republics. The obligations were documented in thousands of loan agreements governed by the laws of multiple Western jurisdictions. Gorbachev's government could no longer service this debt from current revenues. Oil prices had partially recovered, but remained far below the levels of the early 1980s. Export earnings were insufficient to cover import needs and debt service simultaneously. The Soviet Union was functionally bankrupt, surviving only because Western banks continued to roll over maturing obligations rather than trigger a formal default. The bankers had a phrase for this arrangement. They called it extend and pretend. They extended the maturities of Soviet loans while pretending that full repayment remained possible. The alternative was to recognize losses that would devastate their balance sheets and potentially trigger a broader financial crisis. But extend and pretend requires a stable counterparty, and the Soviet Union was disintegrating. In June 1991, Boris Yeltsin was elected president of the Russian Republic, the largest Soviet constituent state. Yeltsin was openly hostile to the Soviet central government. He began asserting Russian control over resources and enterprises located on Russian territory. The question of who owed the Soviet debt became suddenly urgent. Western banks scrambled to understand the legal implications. Their loans were made to Soviet entities. If the Soviet Union ceased to exist, who would inherit the obligations? Would Russia assume responsibility for all Soviet debt, or would it be divided among successor states? Would the new governments honor obligations incurred by a regime they had helped to overthrow? The August 1991 coup attempt, followed by its rapid failure, accelerated the collapse. Republic after republic declared independence. Ukraine, the second-largest Soviet state, voted overwhelmingly to leave the Union. The Baltic states, which had never accepted Soviet annexation, reasserted their independence. The Soviet Union was fragmenting into 15 separate countries, and $70 billion in debt was fragmenting with it. On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as president of a country that no longer existed. The Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. The ideological rival that had challenged Western capitalism for 7 decades vanished from the map. Western banks were left holding claims against a ghost. The debt negotiations that followed lasted throughout the 1990s. Russia eventually agreed to assume responsibility for all Soviet debt in exchange for all Soviet foreign assets. The other successor states were relieved of obligations they could never have paid. Russia then sought to restructure the inherited debt, spreading payments over decades and securing reductions in principal. The banks recovered more than they had feared, but less than they had hoped. The Soviet debt was eventually settled at substantial discounts, with payments extending into the 21st century. Russia made its final payment on Tsarist-era bonds predating the Soviet Union itself, in 1996. The financial relationship between Russia and the West was normalized, but at a significant cost to creditors who had believed that superpowers always pay. The consequences for the former Soviet citizens were far more severe. The economic collapse that accompanied the Soviet dissolution destroyed savings, livelihoods, and lives. Hyperinflation in 1992 wiped out the purchasing power of ruble-denominated assets. Pensioners who had saved their entire lives found their savings worthless. Workers who had depended on state enterprises found themselves unemployed. The social safety net that the Soviet system had provided, however inadequately, was torn apart. Life expectancy in Russia fell by 7 years during the 1990s. Suicide rates soared. Alcoholism became epidemic. The population decline that demographers call the Russian mortality crisis claimed millions of lives that would have been lived under a functioning economic system. Western banks, by contrast, absorbed their losses and moved on. Deutsche Bank wrote off bad Soviet debt and expanded into new markets. Commerzbank restructured its Eastern European exposure and returned to profitability. The institutions that had financed the communist experiment survived its failure. They emerged from the Cold War chastened, but intact, ready to lend to the next generation of emerging market borrowers. The capitalist system that Marx had predicted would collapse from its internal contradictions had instead demonstrated remarkable resilience. It had absorbed a major debt crisis, adapted to the transformation of the global political order, and emerged stronger than before. The banks that had bet on the Soviet Union's creditworthiness had lost that bet, but they had survived to bet again. The final accounting of the Western banks' relationship with the Soviet economy reveals a profound truth about the nature of financial power. The institutions that Marx denounced as instruments of capitalist exploitation outlasted the system built to replace them. The Soviet Union borrowed from Western banks because it could not generate sufficient capital internally. It paid interest to Western shareholders because its own economy could not produce the returns necessary to fund modernization. It became dependent on capitalist credit because the socialist alternative had failed to deliver the prosperity it promised. Think about what this means. The Soviet leadership believed they were using Western banks to strengthen socialism. They believed that borrowed technology would accelerate Soviet development, that temporary debts would be repaid from the fruits of progress, that capitalism was providing the rope for its own hanging. They discovered instead that debt creates dependency, that creditors acquire leverage, and that interest compounds relentlessly regardless of ideology. The story of Western banks and the Soviet economy teaches several lessons that remain relevant today. The first lesson is that creditworthiness is not permanent. The Soviet Union seemed like an invulnerable borrower, a nuclear superpower with vast resources and a government that controlled everything. Western banks assumed that such borrowers do not default. They learned that any borrower can default when circumstances change sufficiently. The risk premium they charged was insufficient compensation for the risks they took. The second lesson is that financial relationships create political leverage. The Soviet Union's dependence on Western credit gave Western governments tools of influence that supplemented military containment. When the United States wanted to punish Soviet aggression in Afghanistan, restricting credit was as effective as any sanction. The banks became instruments of policy, whether they intended to or not. The third lesson is that compound interest is merciless. The Soviet leadership borrowed, assuming that oil prices would remain high, that interest rates would remain low, that economic growth would generate the revenues needed for repayment. Every assumption proved wrong. The debt compounded while the economy stagnated. Mathematics is not ideological. When creditors today lend to authoritarian governments with resource-dependent economies, remember the Soviet example. When borrowers assume that favorable conditions will persist indefinitely, remember the oil crash of 1986. When analysts assess sovereign creditworthiness based on current resources rather than institutional sustainability, remember that the Soviet Union looked creditworthy until it did not. Remember that the most enduring power is often the quietest, recorded not in military parades, but in loan agreements. The towers of Deutsche Bank still rise above Frankfurt's skyline. The trading floors of the City of London still hum with activity. The institutions that lent to the Soviet Union survived its collapse and prospered in the decades that followed. The system that promised to bury capitalism was itself buried, in part by the debts it owed to capitalist institutions. The ideology that denounced compound interest as exploitation discovered that exploitation cuts both ways. The superpower that fielded 40,000 tanks could not service $70 billion in loans. This is the lesson of how Western banks outlasted the Soviet economy. You can reject capitalist ideology. You can denounce bourgeois finance. You can build an alternative system based on different principles, but if you borrow money, you must repay it. And interest never stops compounding. I'm John, and this is the Cinematic Historian channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming.